I can never read the passage that we heard from today's book of Genesis, the first reading today, the one about God's setting a rainbow in the clouds after the flood as a sign of the covenant he intended with Noah, without thinking back to something that happened to me more than 50 years ago. At that time, I wasn't a priest. I was a soldier serving in Vietnam. And the incident that I'm talking about occurred in a small fire base out in the middle of nowhere during the rainy season. It rained so much, and there was so much mud, that a 2.5-ton truck sank until only the top of the cab was visible. It had to be abandoned. There was no way of getting it out. Not only was the weather bad, there was lots of enemy activity in the area. One day, a fighter jet dropped napalm less than 100 yards outside our perimeter to ward off an attack. And as if to rub in the grimness of the situation, if you can believe it, the name of the firebase was Joy. Firebase Joy. The Army loves dark humor. One day the rain stopped, the clouds parted, the sun shone through, revealing a beautiful blue sky. We hadn't seen that in quite a while. And then, as if by magic, not one, but two perfect rainbows arched across the sky from one horizon to the other. It was one of the most spectacular displays of natural beauty I've ever seen, the more impressive for the thoroughly miserable setting in which it occurred. Noah could not have been happier than I was seeing his rainbow compared to me seeing mine. And I didn't need to hear the voice of God to believe that he had used the forces of nature to paint those two rainbows in the sky as a sign that we were not alone, that he was with us. My grandmother on my mother's side always said that I was never the same when I came home from Vietnam. It wasn't meant as a criticism. She just noticed that a fairly light-hearted, fun-loving kid seemed much more serious to her. Being a priest and dealing with so much sadness and loss over the years probably hasn't done much to bring out my class clown side. But God is good, and if he hasn't always spared me flood tides, deserts, and the assaults of wild beasts, some external, some internal, he's given me an eye for rainbows and angels, and he sent enough of them my way so that I was able to keep my head above water in the floods, my heart hopeful even in the deserts, and my soul mostly at peace even in the presence of wild beasts. One of the angels God sent me was an old Hungarian immigrant. She grew up in dire poverty and brought up her children alone in this country after her husband abandoned her and the kids. She made her living scrubbing floors. By the time I met her, she was bedridden and blind. She was one of my communion calls. Shortly before she died, and right after I had given her communion one day, she looked in my direction. Her blind eyes literally seemed to be radiating light, and she had a beaming smile on her face, not attractive after her very difficult life, but strangely moving nevertheless. And here's what she said to me: "Life is beautiful, hard, but beautiful." Blind though she was, she could see rainbows, and angels, and consequently had become a token and an instrument of God's love herself. Maybe it's just the dour side of me, the one my grandmother saw when I came home from Vietnam, but I'm not terribly hopeful about the immediate future of our church, our country, our world. But whether or not I'm right or wrong about that, I don't place too much hope in politicians or economists or scientific experts of various sorts in terms of their making things better. They'll do important work and they'll do the best they can, but there'll always be floods and deserts and wild beasts. Our hope is in God, who is Lord of all creation, master of floods and deserts and wild beasts, and of rainbows and angels. My elderly Hungarian communion call was blind, bedridden, poor, and sick. But because of the light that was in her, the light of Christ, she could say, life is beautiful, hard, but beautiful. If that's blindness, I'll take it. God bless you all for being here today. And God grant all of us the vision to see the angels and rainbows God sends us as tokens of his presence and love, even in the most difficult of times.